In my limited experience as a Catholic, I've noticed that there are approximately three kinds of stereotypes in the church that you may encounter. The first is the progressive Catholic, which is someone who has wholly bought into the superstition of progressivism. They believe in something like a Darwinian principle in the universe that ensures that things get better because of relentless change. Just like in natural selection, it may take countless mutations for something to become an adaptation, but this is the only way for us to move forward, to embrace the process of novelty and mutation, in spite of the many failures it will inevitably produce before creating something like an improvement. And they don't just want to experiment with change in some kind of a sandbox or a controlled environment like a laboratory. They want live specimens. They want to conduct these experiments in the church with your children as guinea pigs. Then there is the more traditionally oriented. You might call them Orthodox, sometimes conservative, or even traditionalist. Their view is that our first instinct should always be to adhere to tradition, the teachings, the practices, and the culture which have come down to us through the ages and have been shaped and molded by each generation until it was offered to us as a cultural inheritance. They see progress as something that can only be achieved by building upon what has come before, rather than demolishing what is in order to perpetually rebuild from scratch. But then there is this third type, which is more subtle and difficult to identify. They move in between both of those opposites and might even think of themselves as moderates in many respects. But when you push them, when push comes to shove, they actually believe that true tradition is far more subtle, perhaps even mysterious or esoteric than those naive traditionalists would have you believe. And that because of their shrewd investigation into the subtleties and mysteries of the ancient traditions, they are among the few who actually understand it and know how to implement it. And while this group may seem uncommon or elusive, I would say that I've encountered it at least as much, if not more, than the others, especially among the clergy. When I was a newly confirmed Catholic and was blissfully unaware of these kinds of distinctions, there was a priest I became quite familiar and even friends with at a certain point, who I think exemplified this third type. He was popular as a priest because he was charismatic and an entertaining preacher. He could captivate his audience well and keep our attention. And there was one homily he gave that made a striking impression on me, and I know that because I can still vividly remember it today. He was talking about this very thing, and he used the opportunity to throw a few punches towards traditionalists, and especially those who prefer the old Latin Mass. He said, they think they are the true traditional Catholics, but if they were really committed to tradition, they wouldn't want the Mass in Latin. They would want it in Greek or even Hebrew or Aramaic, which were the languages that the first Mass was probably said in by the Lord himself. And I remember thinking at the time, as someone who had never met a person who preferred the Latin Mass, like, yeah, those people are so dumb. The Latin Mass isn't the oldest form of the Mass. And now, as someone who is intimately familiar with the kinds of people who attend the Latin Mass and count myself as one of them, I can confidently say that nobody who attends the Latin Mass does so because they think Latin is the oldest language used by the church, and that this somehow boosts their traditional bona fide. No pun intended there. And now, more recently, it was shared with me by some priests in my archdiocese that at their recent formation retreat, which they do a couple times a year, one of their lecturers did this exact same thing while discussing questions about the practice of receiving communion, either on the hand or on the tongue. So he claimed that some Catholics, those traditionalist types, they believe that receiving communion on the tongue is the more traditional form, but actually the oldest practice, and therefore it's implied the more traditional one, is to receive on the hand. And to support this claim, he cited an obscure Eastern Orthodox council from the 7th century that was never ratified by Rome, which gives instruction that communicants should receive on the hand. So there you have it. The oldest form is to receive in the hand, and as this lecturer concluded, that makes it the truly traditional form that those traditionalists don't even know about. But here's the thing about tradition. It isn't esoteric. It isn't some hidden knowledge that you have to go back hundreds or maybe even thousands of years to uncover. That's Gnosticism. Gnosticism, which was one of the first great heresies, taught that Jesus came to uncover hidden knowledge for a select few about the mysteries of the universe. And I find some academically oriented clerics and theologians act like their superior formation positions them in a similar way, where only they know the hidden secrets of the faith. And if you're lucky, they'll share some of that with you, like references to ancient, obscure, unratified Eastern Orthodox councils, which say that communion in the hand is apparently the best. But that simply is not what tradition in the church is. Tradition has nothing to do with the oldest teaching or practice. That's antiquarianism. Tradition means adhering to the faith that has been handed down by the apostles and transmitted and sometimes developed by each generation until it finds you at a moment in history poised to inherit it. You can either accept it and maybe further develop it if needed, and then hand it on, or you can reject it and say, I'm going to cherry pick the things I like from history or from the present mood that suit my preferences and then only adhere to those things, making your religion only about you and your preferences. Now, let me try to address this question about reception of Holy Communion, even though we shouldn't be having this discussion because the magisterium has already had it for us and concluded that communion on the tongue is the normative traditional practice. After Vatican II, a council of bishops and theologians were consulted on this question by the Pope. They even surveyed over 2,000 bishops to get their input on this question, and the overwhelming majority said no to the question, should communion on the hand be permitted? Then, after the work of this study group, Pope St. Paul VI published a document called Memoriale Domini, which confirmed that the normative traditional practice for the church was communion on the tongue. And it gives a beautiful exposition for why it draws this conclusion, which is why I would encourage you to go Google Memoriale Domini. It's at most 2 pages long, I think, so it's an easy and quick read. The document then goes on to say that in places where communion on the hand was already being practiced as an abuse, bishops could ask for an indult, which is an exception to the law, which is what we have now in Canada and the United States, as if it's normative. We fail to appreciate that we're living in this practice that is actually an indult or an exception. Communion on the hand isn't the normative tradition. It's a grave exception to the magisterial instruction that I would argue, are now abusing. Okay, fine, but some of us need more than authoritative citations. Some of us still need to be convinced rationally. It needs to be explained to us why this is the case. And there's a lot of reasons I could give, but none of them compare to this. Almost everyone I know has a story to tell of someone trying to pocket or walk away with the host or not receive it properly. I've witnessed it happen myself, and I'm sure you could get similar stories out of most Catholics. And why people do this is anybody's guess, but it's probably worth noting that the rituals of the Satanic Black Mass, which you can read about on Wikipedia, this isn't some sort of hidden conspiracy theory, it requires the presence of a consecrated host stolen from a Catholic church. So just think about that. Communion on the hand significantly increases the likelihood of the host being stolen, desecrated, or profaned. And in any evaluation of our disciplines and traditions in the church, if it's an evaluation of outcomes that says, in one scenario, we're making it far, far more likely that the precious body, blood, soul, and divinity of our blessed Lord will be desecrated and imperil the souls of those doing it, knowingly or unknowingly, and the other will prevent such spiritual catastrophes, then it's a no-brainer. The latter option is always the right answer. How could anyone who thinks of themselves as a faithful disciple of the Lord, someone who loves the Lord, think otherwise? No true minister of the Eucharist would hesitate for a second between those two alternatives, unless they don't actually believe in transubstantiation. This is why the tradition developed over time, in order to prevent sacrilege and abuse of the sacrament, and in order to ensure reverence for it. to instead make this a topic about some kind of competition of who is the most traditional based on who can appeal to the oldest obscure reference to the practice you prefer is an absurd distraction from the fundamental question here. And besides, we don't have to play that game. The magisterium investigated for us and gave us an answer in Memoriale Domini. That's the beauty of being Catholic. You don't have to be Indiana Jones gathering artifacts and solving esoteric riddles, and nor do you need a PhD in theology to know what the tradition is. The Church's magisterium does it for us, and that's why I, as a traditional Catholic, adhere to the tradition that was handed on directly by the previous generation of the magisterium, rather than grasping at antiquity to try to boost my own sense of superiority as the only person who knows what the real secret tradition is. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support, so if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.